Putin signed the new strategic deal with Iran. He already had a comprehensive treaty with North Korea. Whom do they make such deals against? Against you, against us, against Europe, against America. We must not forget about it. It's not by chance. These are the strategic priorities, and our priorities must match the challenge in politics and in defense and in economy. Europe needs to learn how to fully take care of itself so that the world can't afford to ignore it. It's vital to maintain unity in Europe because the world doesn't care about just Budapest or Brussels. It cares about Europe as a whole. And we need a united European security and defense policy, and all European countries must be willing to spend as much on security as it truly needed, not just as much as they have gotten used to during years of neglect.
Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to try to understand Zelensky's call for a unified Europe. You know, we've got some pretty intense reports coming from the front lines, speeches, expert analysis, and it's really painting a stark picture of a continent and really a whole world kind of teetering on the edge here. So imagine you're at Davos, right? You're at the World Economic Forum, you're in that room, surrounded by, global power players, right?
Yeah.
And Zelensky is speaking, but he's not just like asking for help. He's going way beyond that. He's laying out this vision for a Europe that is stronger, more self-reliant.
And what's so interesting is that he's doing this at a time when, the war in Ukraine has entered this new phase. It's even more brutal than what we've seen before. And some reports are suggesting that Russia has actually drastically increased the number of troops they have there, like up to 680,000 soldiers.
680,000.
Yeah, that's 3 times what they had earlier in the conflict.
3 times.
Yep.
Wow, that's a big jump. I mean, it's got to be putting a huge strain on Ukrainian forces.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And there are these reports from January that show that over 3,375 Ukrainian troops were killed or wounded in just 48 hours.
Just 48 hours.
Yeah. And on top of that, we're also seeing reports that Ukraine has lost a lot of those key NATO-supplied weapons, like the U.S.-made armored personnel carriers and some of those advanced artillery systems that we've been hearing so much about.
Right. Okay, so yeah, the situation is definitely escalating rapidly. So what is Zelensky's response to this? I mean, obviously beyond just needing more military aid, what's his big picture strategy here?
So he's gone beyond just asking for more weapons. He's actually called for this massive international peacekeeping force to be deployed to Ukraine, like a 200,000 strong force.
200,000? I mean, that's a huge number. For context, isn't that like basically the size of France's entire military?
It is. It really is. And it's clear that he doesn't want this force to just be a symbolic gesture. He's talking about, a real security guarantee, something that will deter further Russian aggression. He even said explicitly that he's very skeptical of a purely symbolic force.
Right, because that wouldn't really change the situation on the ground at all, would it?
Yeah.
But to put together a force that big, I mean, that's got to be a huge undertaking logistically, politically. I mean, do you think it's even feasible?
Well, it's a very bold proposal, and it does raise a lot of questions. The first one being, will European nations actually commit the necessary resources? Because remember, this isn't just about sending troops. It's about equipping and sustaining them for what could be a very, very long deployment.
Right, yeah. And, I mean, wouldn't something like that be seen as a provocation by Russia? I mean, could it actually make the conflict worse?
That is a key consideration. Deploying such a large force could definitely be seen as a direct threat from Moscow. And we have to remember, Russia has already shown that they're willing to escalate the conflict, both militarily and with their rhetoric. So the risk of unintended consequences is certainly there.
Okay, so a lot of risks, for sure. But what are the potential benefits from Zelensky's perspective? I mean, what is he hoping to achieve by pushing for this peacekeeping force?
I think he's thinking long term here. It's not just about stopping the fighting that's happening right now. It's about really changing the whole security landscape in the region. He wants to make it crystal clear that any future aggression against Ukraine is going to be met with this swift and just overwhelming international response.
So it's about deterring future conflict by showing a united front. And this ties in with his broader calls for European unity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This isn't just about Ukraine's security. This is about the future of Europe as a whole. Zelensky has become increasingly vocal about his concerns over Europe's reliance on the U.S., particularly with, the America First agenda coming back into the picture.
Yeah, and he's been pretty straightforward about it, too. I remember that quote where he said, Europe can't afford to be second or third in line for its allies. The world will start moving forward without Europe.
Exactly. And he's not saying that Europe should abandon its alliance with the US. He's just urging them to shift toward becoming more self-sufficient. He's basically saying, look, Europe needs to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, whether that's in defense technology or diplomacy.
So this call for a peacekeeping force, it's almost like a test case for European unity. If they can actually pull this off, it sends a strong message, not just to Russia, but to the rest of the world. But what if they can't agree on something this crucial?
The implications go way beyond just the conflict in Ukraine. It really raises the question of what role Europe wants to play in the world in the 21st century.
Right, okay, so we've got this really ambitious, some might say audacious proposal for a peacekeeping force, and it is all tied into this larger question of European unity and self-reliance. But we can't forget that there's another really big player in this, and that's President Trump.
Right, and his vision for peace in Ukraine seems to be very different from Zelensky's. Zelensky's calling for strength, a long-term security solution. But Trump seems much more focused on just resolving the conflict quickly.
And this is where things start to get really complicated. Because if Zelensky's pushing for a stronger, more independent Europe, and Trump wants a quick peace, potentially one that requires concessions from Ukraine, well, I can see how that could create some serious tension both within Europe and between the U.S. and its allies.
It's definitely a delicate situation. And it raises all sorts of questions about what kind of peace Trump would accept, what role Europe would play in any negotiations, and ultimately whether any peace agreement could actually address the root of this conflict.
And we're going to dive into those questions in just a bit. But for now, let's stick with Zelensky's vision for a unified Europe. What would that actually look like in practice? I mean, beyond the military aspects, what are the economic and political dimensions of this idea?
That's a great question. And it's something that Zelensky has addressed in several of his speeches. He talks about the need for a European economy that is much more integrated, one that is less reliant on external powers like Russia for energy and resources. He's also emphasized how important it is to have a unified European foreign policy so that Europe can speak with one voice on the global stage.
So it's not just about building a European army, it's about creating this really cohesive and independent bloc that can actually take action on the world stage.
Exactly. And this vision has the potential to reshape not only Europe, but the entire global balance of power in the years ahead. It's a vision with a lot of moving parts. It makes you wonder, can Europe really pull this off? I mean, historically, European unity has been more of an aspiration than a reality, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's true. Europe isn't exactly known for making decisions quickly or presenting a united front, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And let's be real, there are a lot of competing interests and priorities within the EU.
Oh, absolutely. And then there are all the internal divisions within Europe. Some countries are really wary of Russia. They have this historical baggage that you just can't ignore. And then you have others that are more focused on the economic ties and maintaining a more pragmatic relationship.
And we can't forget about the economic challenges Europe is facing right now. I mean, the cost of living crisis, energy security, concerns the rise of all these populist movements. All of that puts so much pressure on leaders to focus on domestic issues. It makes you wonder if they really have the bandwidth to even think about something as ambitious as what Zelensky's proposing.
It's a valid point. Zelensky is basically asking European leaders to get out of their comfort zones, to make these really tough choices that might not be popular with voters. He's asking them to invest in long-term security at a time when so many people are just trying to make ends meet.
It's almost like he's saying, look, I know you've got a lot on your plate right now, but if you don't deal with these really fundamental issues, you're going to pay an even bigger price down the road.
And he's not wrong. A weak and divided Europe is vulnerable, not only to threats from outside, like Russia, but also to internal pressures that could completely unravel the entire project of European integration.
So what would this stronger, more unified Europe actually look like? I mean, Zelensky has talked about, greater self-sufficiency in defense, technology, diplomacy, but what are the specifics?
Well, he has laid out some pretty concrete proposals. For example, he's called for a European Iron Dome, a missile defense system that could protect the entire continent from all kinds of threats, not just from Russia. He's also been pushing for much more cooperation when it comes to developing and producing these really advanced weapon systems. Things like drones and artillery.
So he's not just talking about pooling resources for peacekeeping. He wants a fundamental shift in Europe's entire defense industrial base.
Right. He's saying that Europe needs to be able to defend itself. It can't just rely on the U.S. for protection.
And it's not just about the military hardware, is it? I mean, he's also been really vocal about the need for Europe to take the lead in areas like artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies.
Yeah, he's been very clear about that.
Mhm.
He even said that if Europe falls behind in this global tech race, they risk losing this century. Which is kind of a stark warning, but I think it reflects his understanding that power in the 21st century isn't just about tanks and missiles. It's about innovation data, controlling the technologies that will shape the future.
Okay, so we're starting to see this picture emerge of a Europe that's not just militarily strong, but also technologically advanced and economically integrated. But how do you actually put that into action? What are the steps that Europe needs to take to get there?
Well, first things first, it's going to require a huge increase in defense spending. Most European countries are spending way below the 2% of GDP target that NATO set.
Right, and that's been a point of contention between the U.S. and Europe for years.
Exactly. And Zelensky is basically echoing that criticism. He's saying Europe needs to take responsibility for its own security. But it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about spending it wisely.
So investing in the right technologies, developing a more coordinated defense strategy, and actually making sure those resources are being used effectively.
Exactly. And then there's the question of political will. And this is where things get really tricky. Because to move towards a more integrated European foreign policy, you have to give up some national sovereignty, which is something that a lot of countries are just not comfortable doing.
Now, you can see why. It's one thing to cooperate on things like trade or environmental policy, but it's another thing entirely to give up control over matters of war and peace.
It's a huge step.
Yeah.
And it would require a level of trust and cooperation that Europe has often struggled to achieve in the past.
But if they could pull it off, if they could actually create this truly unified front, that would be a game changer, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It would send a very powerful message to the world that Europe is a force to be reckoned with, that it can actually shape global events rather than just react to them.
And it would make Europe a much more appealing partner for countries like the U.S., wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if they see a Europe that is strong and unified, they'll be much more willing to invest in that relationship, both politically and economically.
That's a key point. Zelensky isn't saying that Europe should become an adversary to the U.S. He's arguing for a more balanced and equal partnership, and that's something that would benefit everyone.
It's interesting because, in a way, he's making a case for a stronger Europe that aligns with what some people in the U.S. have been advocating for years. But at the same time, he's also challenging the U.S. to be a more dependable and consistent partner.
It's a delicate balancing act, and it
Yeah.
remains to be seen whether European leaders will actually embrace this vision and whether the U.S. will respond in a way that strengthens the transatlantic alliance rather than weakens it.
But in the middle of all this, we can't forget that there's a war going on in Ukraine. And President Trump seems to have a very different approach to ending that war.
Yes, and that's where the potential for conflict comes in. Because while Zelensky is focused on these long-term solutions and a stronger Europe, Trump is more interested in a quick resolution. He wants to see this war end, and he wants to see it end soon.
And he's even hinted at being willing to work with Putin to achieve that goal. But what would that mean for Ukraine? And what would it mean for the future of Europe? It makes you wonder what Trump is thinking here. Is it really just about getting a quick win, or is there something more to it?
Well, there are definitely a few things going on. I mean, you've got his personal relationship with Putin, which has always been kind of a mystery. Then you've got his tendency to want to make deals. He really believes that he can negotiate a solution where others have failed.
And we can't forget his America First perspective. I mean, he's said pretty consistently that he sees this as a European problem, not an American one.
Right. He keeps saying that Europe needs to do more to defend itself and that the U.S. shouldn't be the one footing the bill. And that's caused some friction with Zelensky, who, as we've talked about, is really relying on U.S. support.
It's almost like Zelensky is stuck between these two very different approaches. Trump wants a quick peace, and Zelensky wants a stronger, more independent Europe.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in. On one hand, he needs Trump's support to keep fighting Russia, but on the other hand, he doesn't want to be forced into a peace deal that isn't good for Ukraine.
So where does that leave Europe? If Trump makes a deal with Putin that basically leaves Ukraine hanging, wouldn't that totally undermine the whole idea of European unity and solidarity?
It definitely could. It would tell the world that the U.S. is willing to put its own interests first, even if it hurts its allies. And that could have some really long-term consequences for that transatlantic alliance.
So what are some possible scenarios here? What could a peace deal brokered by Trump look like?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but some people have suggested that it could involve Ukraine giving up some territory, maybe recognizing Russia's control of Crimea or giving more autonomy to the Donbas region.
Do you think Zelensky would be willing to accept those kinds of concessions?
Probably not. He's been very clear that Ukraine is not going to give up any of its territory. And any deal that involves giving land to Russia would be incredibly unpopular in Ukraine.
So we could be headed for a real showdown here. If Trump pushes for a deal that Zelensky rejects, it could cause a rift between the U.S. and Ukraine, and maybe even within NATO.
It's definitely a possibility, and that would be a huge win for Putin, who has been trying to divide the West from the very beginning.
This whole situation is so complex, it feels like we're at a crossroads with two very different paths in front of us.
And the decisions that are made in the next few months will have a huge impact, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe and the whole world.
So let's zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture here. What are the broader implications of Zelensky's vision for a unified Europe and Trump's desire for peace in Ukraine?
Well, in a way, it's a fight between two different ideas about what the future of Europe should look like. Zelensky wants a Europe that's strong and independent, one that can stand up to Russia and make its own way on the global stage. Trump, on the other hand, seems to want a Europe that's more dependent on the U.S. for security and more willing to work with Russia.
And all of this is happening at a time when we're seeing the rise of authoritarianism, economic uncertainty, and a shift in global power that's challenging all the old rules.
It's a time of huge change and uncertainty, and the choices that leaders make in Washington, Moscow, Kiev, and Brussels will affect how things play out for years to come.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? How do you see the situation playing out? What role do you think the U.S. should play in shaping the future of Europe and the world?
You know, even though things look pretty grim, Zelensky's message offers a little bit of hope. It suggests that even with all the conflict and division, there's still a chance for a better future. A future where democracy and freedom win. A future where countries work together to solve problems, and where Europe is a force for stability in a world that's full of turmoil. It all depends on whether we're brave enough and determined enough to make that happen.
It's definitely a lot to think about. And we hope that this deep dive has given you some new ways of looking at this really important issue. Thanks for listening.